So let me start with this. Policing here is extreme. The US is unquestionably one of the most policed states in the world. You've probably already heard that the US has more people in jail and prison than any other country, but that doesn't actually capture the full scale of things. About 1 in 100 people in the US is behind bars right now. 2.3 million people. More prisoners than 194 other countries combined. And there's only like 200 countries out there. The US on its own holds a fifth of all the prisoners on Earth. Our police are also far more violent. Per year, they kill about 1,000 people. The second place among wealthy countries is Canada, and Canadian cops kill about 30. Not only are US police killing more, there's also zero accountability for this violence. According to Human Rights Watch, about 98% of police killings in the US never result in officers being charged with a crime. And still, year after year, Democrats and Republicans alike talk about how great and valuable our cops are. Biden signs the American Rescue Plan, and cops all over the country get $350 billion to hire more police officers, get more overtime pay and bonuses, and get decked out in the latest military gear. That means tiny towns like Prosper, Texas, not too far from here, truly one of the most boring, uneventful places I know, has beat cops riding in $700,000 10-foot-tall armored trucks. Now, $350 billion is hard to grasp. Here it is in a more manageable format. What you're looking at are what's called million-dollar blocks. Places in the country, usually in big cities, where single blocks get over $1 million spent on incarceration alone per year. And just think about where you live right now. Think about what would happen if every year the city decided to spend $1 million on making your block better. Whether that's renovations, upgrades, new businesses, events, or just gave you and your neighbors a couple thousand extra bucks each to spend on your home. That's not what's happening. In America's poorest and blackest neighborhoods, the budget doesn't go towards making things better. It's huge, and it goes towards throwing people away. This is the carceral logic of the American capitalist system. And here's how it works. Under the neoliberal version of capitalism we've had in the US since Reagan, government policy has looked something like this. Every administration makes people more vulnerable by cutting social and public services, refusing to raise the minimum wage, pushing back the age of retirement, defunding things like the NLRB to weaken unions, and deepening government deficits not for anything useful, but to increase incarceration, policing, military spending, and private deregulation. It's how you get graphs like these, and cops that look like this. The neoliberal mantra is that you make things better for businesses by pulling the rug out from organized labor, making endless calls for everyone to become an entrepreneur, more cops, and forcing people to take on more debt, either through student loans or credit cards. People need to pay this debt back, and to do that, you work longer hours, at worse jobs, for lower real wages in a society that, year after year, increases the pool of people who can't afford an unexpected $500 hospital bill. Thanks to outsourcing, automation, and leaner business practices geared towards maximizing stock prices, there are fewer real, non-gig jobs, and more people need to work 2 or 3 of them to get by. At the same time, more and more privatized services, like housing, also means things like rent keep increasing. And just like that, you've created widespread poverty and insecurity with fewer solutions to escape it and more dire consequences for those who can't. But that's not enough. Managing this widespread insecurity that's so beneficial for capitalist accumulation is difficult without conceding any ground to activists and organized workers. So it starts being in the state's interest to redefine our concept of crime and apply it more broadly to the state's targets so it can manage this situation. People don't usually love that their needs aren't being met no matter what they do, and they might start getting the funny idea that upsetting this status quo, taking back control, and redistributing wealth and power more fairly is a good thing. They could start organizing, imposing demands on their bosses, taking charge of their neighborhoods themselves, or just trying their best to get on an equal footing with those born into privilege. That sort of behavior, the more it starts threatening the stability and negative peace of this violent system, needs to become labeled as irrational and criminal so it can be justifiably repressed to protect the exclusive entitlements of a few. So now, media organizations, both news and entertainment, government bodies, courts, and politicians start moving the goalpost on what they consider crime. And upholding this system, exploiting workers, keeping people exposed to the daily violence of not having enough, that's not part of their definition. The FBI's crime statistics aren't about the number of people suddenly thrown in cages by the state after yet another new crime bill. Nor does the report include what white-collar criminals get up to when they slowly rob millions of people of their retirement savings. No, the label crime is exclusively applied to things like petty theft, armed robbery, property destruction, homicide, and all these other crimes of opportunity that are inevitable when people's needs are being denied to them. To aid in this effort, context gets completely steamrolled by liberal concepts of equal justice and the introduction of more rational criminal procedures like mandatory minimums. We trust retail companies when they broadcast that petty theft is on the rise. Crime rates are presented as objective reflections of reality to the public, decontextualized from the increased level of policing. And the predictable result is that criminal sentencing procedures systematically reaffirm the capitalist hierarchy. Some groups get charged with more severe crimes and more jail time. But because this system has been rationalized, because the concept of crime has been crafted around this specific purpose, and because the context of the state's control over people's livelihoods is treated as a completely separate question, none of this gets challenged. Politicians always get to ask for more cops, more prisons, and more guns. Because, after all, the crime numbers don't lie. Crime control becomes the regulation of a relatively small number of acts that have been designated as threatening the social order, and the administration of criminal justice becomes the institutionalized or patterned responses for processing those threats. This way of criminal justice functioning becomes accepted and normalized. Ideologies, legal and otherwise, convince people that the patterns are inevitable and just. To make this project of criminalization especially successful, our leaders rely on crime as a tool for othering along racial, gendered, sexual, and class lines, to the point that this othering comes to justify just about anything. It structures the capitalist hierarchy, lends legitimacy to those whose privileges allow them a higher standing than those who are othered, and enables the violence of more extreme policing against some. They shift the explanation for bigoted state repression away from the structural factors that make some groups' disempowerment profitable, and towards rooting out the bad apples from this perfectly neutral enforcement of law and order. Some people's identities and their efforts to live equal lives to the privileged become synonymous with crime. And once that criminality is established and ingrained, anything and everything is allowed. Cops can never go too far in punishing these obvious criminals, terrorists, communists, and those people who are branded as definitionally violent. The result is a system in which the solution to every social ill becomes the police. We throw cops at homelessness, mental health crises, poverty, and fare evasion while demanding that public schools, public transportation, and entire communities get by with much less than enough. And you can very clearly see the inevitable consequences when protests start getting in the way of this capitalist society's goals. At around midnight on April 30th, a group of Columbia students occupied Hamilton Hall in an act of protest against the university's involvement and investment in the Israeli apartheid state and the genocide of Palestinians. 4 days earlier, former NYPD captain and current mayor of New York, Eric Adams, was on a Zoom call with a group of heavily invested billionaires. On that call, according to WhatsApp chat logs filled with dozens of Forbes 100 capitalists, this group discussed the various ways that they could leverage their tremendous wealth, influence, and connections to help Adams in his crackdown of student protests. They talked about making campaign donations to the Adams Re-election Fund, hiring private investigators, putting pressure on the Columbia administration, whatever it would take to get police officers to handle protesters. At the same time, a narrative began to take hold of mainstream media that this occupation and the escalation of protest it represented in response to an administration unwilling to accept students' demands was a step too far. What they were doing was labeled by pundits across the political spectrum as a violent crime. And now that the protesters were criminals, nothing could protect them.
So let me be clear. Peaceful protest in America. Violent protest is not protected. Peaceful protest is. It's against the law when violence occurs. Destroying property is not a peaceful protest. It's against the law. Vandalism, trespassing, breaking windows, shutting down campuses, forcing the cancellation of classes and graduations. None of this is a peaceful protest.
You can't convince me that a university with a $13 billion endowment cares about a single broken window. That's not what this is about. And it's certainly not violence. There wasn't a single bloody nose or broken rib until the cops showed up. No, it's an excuse. A line in the sand that justified hundreds of police officers' flashbangs and arrests, the condemnation of a president standing firmly behind a genocidal occupation, and the pearl-clutching of the corporate media. Law and order had been restored. Protesters' criminality had justified it. It justified the press and legal observers not being allowed to document the police's actions, which still today we only have a partial account of. It justified the cops forcefully removing students' hijabs. It justified all the expulsions and the concussions. Suddenly, it wasn't about Palestine anymore. It was about cracking down on inconvenience. And in the days that followed, it justified dozens of bogus misdemeanor and felony charges for trespassing, property damage, burglary, and assault, not unlike the RICO charges brought against Stop Cop City protesters in Atlanta. Here again, the consequences of the racial capitalist state came out in full force. The wealthier and more mediatized Columbia protesters saw their mostly misdemeanor charges dropped relatively quickly. Down the road at CCNY, protesters saw the same violent crackdown as their peers 20 minutes away. But CCNY is a public school. Its students and faculty largely come from lower-income Black and Hispanic families. And so, at the time of writing, the CUNY 22 are still dealing with felony charges that could put them away for years. And as student protesters continue to remind us, all of this pales in comparison to the violence imposed on Palestinians in Gaza and the West Bank. But it's related. So, is the US a police state? It's a matter of opinion. But I think the message the ruling class and their militarized police are sending is pretty clear. They're not hiding it.
And if you're thinking about doing something like this, take a look around, see how fast we cleared it out. This could be you.